took me 20 years to figure out how dumb I was about our country. And the story goes back then for many years, back to 1981, when I was president of a company called Hudson's Bay Oil and Gas, which is no longer there, but it was a classic company in those days. And here I was, the president of that company, at quite a young age. I was less than 50 years old. And this particular day in 1981, the banker that had called on us every year came to visit, and he brought along his chief economist from Zurich, the chief economist of a big Swiss bank. Of course, looked like a economist, Dr. So-and-so, with white wavy hair and a rumpled suit, and, you know, doctor, this is chief economist, okay? So we sat down and had a visit, and he said, well, Mr. Haskayne, how are things with you this year? He said, we travel around the world, and I just thought we'd like to find out. I said, well, do you really want to know? And you remember this, 1981. I said, well, let me tell you this way. First of all, interest rates are 18%. The Canadian dollar is under pressure. We have incredible problems with exchange rates. We have the National Energy Program, which is killing our industry. We have the Foreign Investment Review Act, which is awful for our country. We have new programs, social programs, which we probably can't afford. And anything else you'd really like to know? And I said, well, if you really want to know, Quebec also wants to separate. So anyway, he looked at me and said, you know, Canada is a very wonderful country. And he said, you tell the story different than I envisaged Canada. He said, here you are. You're the second largest country in the world. You live right next to your greatest trading partner. As a result, you have no national security problems. You have an educated workforce. You have wonderful financial resources, and you have all of the benefits of infrastructure, meaning roads and airports and so on and so on. So he said, I could go through a whole list of things that you do well in this country, including its legal system, the governance system, but perhaps of most importance in many respects is your natural resources. And he then went on to describe in his usual academic way and very slowly said you have enormous natural resources in oil and natural gas and minerals and agriculture and fishing. And he gave me this long laundry list. Finally got to the end. And he said, Mr. Haskayne, sir, I suggest that you are a country in search of a problem. And here I was, everything I mentioned, 6 or 7 things, were accurate, and they were deadly accurate. But everything I mentioned were negatives, not one positive, and each of those things were created by us as citizens of the country. And yet everything else, which was extremely well done in terms of their natural resources and how we'd even developed them, and here I am bitching about the country. And so I thought, how stupid can I be? Here, the head of one of the most beneficial persons in the world, because I was a depression baby, got a university education, not many of us at that point. Here I was, head of a big company much earlier than most, just because I was a depression baby. And here I am, the guy telling him about our country and how bad it was. I deserved a kick in the butt, and so I just wanted people to know that we better sometimes sit back, like I should have done, and realize how damn good this country is and what we need to do to get it even better.
So on that note, we structured this talk, so is Canada a country in search of a problem, or is it the best place to do business for the next 25 years? So what we will do is the panelists will each bring up a different point that influences how we are moving forward. And we're going to start with Sharon.
Sure. Thank you, Lauren. Well, talking of Canada's competitiveness, I decided to look at how competitive we are on the trade front. And when we talk of Canada and when we talk of trade, the most important aspect is our enormous trade partnership with the United States. And there is always this concern that are we overly reliant on the United States as a trading partner in terms of having all our eggs in the same basket? So I decided to look at some numbers on that. And on that front, if we look from the start of this century to where we are right now, our overall reliance when it comes to the United States on trade has actually reduced from almost around 74% way back in 2001 to lower 60s right now. And what's also happened simultaneously is that our reliance on trade with other OECD countries as well as with the developing world has increased at that particular point in time. Next.
Okay.
Now, the other big thing to notice is, well, okay, so what's been the global trade growth and how has Canada performed? Are we at pace with the global trade growth? Now, if you see on that particular metric, we are behind where the global trade growth has been. So compared to global trade growth over the last 15 odd years, which has been around 160%, we are at a much more modest 60%. And in part, that can be explained by these red bars there, which is really, if we were to divide the world into simply these two blocks, OECD countries and non-OECD countries, let's call them developing economies, what you'll find is that the majority of trade growth that's coming, and that's driving world trade growth, is coming from either trade that's happening between OECD economies and the developing world, as well as intra-developing world trade. Next. So what I decided to do was, okay, developing world, of course, is not a monolith. Let's kind of try to zoom in into, well, what's really happening here and what's the nature of our exports versus imports. So the first thing that I noticed in terms of our trade with the OECD countries versus the developing economies is that when it comes to the OECD countries, we've had a consistent trade surplus, as you see with the blue line. In contrast, when it comes to the developing economies, we've ran consistent trade deficits. We have a negative trade balance when it comes to developing economies. Now, the follow-up question would be, okay, so well, what's really the nature of this trade in terms of developing economies? What's the nature of our exports and imports? Next, yeah. So now, if you look at it, what I decided to do was, okay, so let's see, of course, as I mentioned, developing economies includes, 200 countries. So I decided to look at, well, what are the top 5 categories that we export to the top developing economies, the BRICS countries, and what are the top 5 product categories that we import? So here I was, part of it was intriguing because this is the developing world, after all, that we are trading with. All the top 5 product categories that we export to them are very resource-based. Maybe not that surprising, but it's pulp of wood, oil seeds, so on and so forth. But what's more interesting here is that what we are importing from them are more value-added imports. Now again, the follow-up question would be, well, are we really different with China being the factory of the world right now? Is it not similar with other advanced economies as well? Next. So what I decided to do was to look at, okay, so what are our top exports to the world and what are the top exports of, let's say, other advanced economies to the world. So let's look at Germany, Japan, Korea, so on and so forth. So if we look at that, again, our top 3 categories, so over here, again, that we export to the BRICS are much more resource-based. In contrast, other advanced economies, they are much more value-added exports. So in that sense, our export profile is much more like an Indonesia or a Brazil rather than some of the other advanced economies. Now this brings to the classic glass half full, half empty question. So it could be argued, with all due respect, that from when it comes to our trade with these BRICS, are we still hewers of wood and drawers of water in one sense? But of course, on the half full side, well, we are incredibly rich with all of these resources, and the question for us is, well, how do we build on that and move towards more value-added exports? So, yeah.
I have a comment on that
Sure.
on that table, and I can absolutely see how it can trigger a knee-jerk negative reactions. So where are the cool gadgets? Where are the slick platforms? What's with all the pulp and grain and all the resource-based commodities? And I actually don't see it as a problem, because I think when Canada is trading in commodities, what we're really trading in is knowledge. So what I mean is when we sell end products, commodity-based end products, what we really are offering is sophisticated management processes, advanced technologies, scientific knowledge that's embedded in these end products. So what I wanted to show you is this chart with the charming name, the smiling curve of value creation. It was developed by the founder of Acer to show how his company is positioned in the manufacturing industry but it's applicable these days beyond manufacturing to the knowledge industries as well. So what you can see is that most value is created at the upturned end of the smiling curve. That's where the knowledge-based processes are located. So at the upstream end of the value chain, the value is in R&D, proprietary technology development, advanced engineering, systems design. At the downstream end, the value is in marketing, brand development, advertising, specialized logistics, customized service. So traditionally, these processes have been performed in advanced economies such as Canada. Now, in the sagging part of the smiling curve is where traditionally the least value is created through more routinized processes such as assembly, manufacturing to specs, routinized logistics. So again, traditionally, these have been performed in emerging economies for cost-saving purposes. But it's changing now because companies like Foxconn are trying to develop new capabilities. They're moving up the smiling curve. So the challenge for Canada, as I see it, is to keep smiling, is to maintain our position at the upturned ends of the smiling curve. And I think we're really well positioned to stay here because we have a highly educated workforce. We score very highly on entrepreneurial thinking year after year in innovation surveys. We have fantastic natural resources, as Mr. Haskayne mentioned. And I think most importantly, we have a very strong base of knowledge, especially in the resource industry. And we should really capitalize on this knowledge. And it's not to say that we should not diversify. But I think we have a history of technological and managerial innovation in the oil industry. So we should really work on using this history to both to produce more efficiently and also to springboard from these innovations into related fields. And it's already happening as we see that oil companies are entering into clean tech. And actually, on a similar note, I think that geographic diversification is overrated as well. Next, please. Okay. So I know that is perhaps a controversial statement, and the words such as globalism and global are really big buzzwords these days. But actually, in our international business research group, we don't overuse these terms because the fact is that most successful trade is actually regional, not global. And most of the world's largest multinationals derive most of the revenues from the home region. So the implication for Canada is, again, not that we should not diversify, but we should really tread carefully as we try to diversify from our strong ties to the US trade, because there's definitely a price attached to globalization. So this diversification will have a large cost. Okay,
Right. If we wanted to move into a more innovation and technology-oriented economy, what would it take? One of the things that I think about when I think about this is the cumulative nature of innovation and technology. Innovations build on other innovations. I see this phenomenon in this new ecosystem of software tools that's becoming available for entrepreneurs. It's like being an entrepreneur and starting a new business has become so much easier. A lot of the grunt work has become automated by building on a series of innovations that have come out recently in the past few years. Actually, I call this phenomenon entrepreneurship technology. And I have a list of some of the famous companies and tools. Interestingly, Canada's not bad. We have a few of the leaders starting from Wave, founded by our very own James Lockery, who's part of the rainforest community here, all the way to Shopify, Hootsuite, and even Slack was built in Canada, although it's not headquartered here. So these are technologies that entrepreneurs build on to create their own innovations. Sometimes they involve regulatory frameworks that need support. So how much is it legal to do your accounting, your contracts electronically? These are things that need regulatory support from the country. One of my favorite examples is crowdfunding. Kickstarter was not legal in Canada when it launched in the US. And a famous story of a chance we might have lost is Pebble, a very successful campaign that sort of broke the records of Kickstarter and raised more than $10 million on Kickstarter, founded by Eric Migikovsky, who was a University of Waterloo grad. And he started working on his project at Waterloo. But the crowdfunding option was not available to him in Canada. He went to the US. There he tried other different options, and crowdfunding was one of the options available at that time, and he managed to be a great success there. After a few years now, Canada now has a good number of Kickstarter projects. It started being legal in 2013 here in Canada. So I've actually tracked the number of projects that we have in Canada. We have about 12,000, but it's nowhere near the number of Kickstarter projects that are happening in the US. This is some data that we've collected at the Haskayne School. The 2016 data is not complete, so that's why the bar is a bit lower. Next. I thought it'd be interesting to compare the Canada and US just on some simple performance indicators in terms of how we're doing on Kickstarter now that it's legal in Canada. Unfortunately, on all the performance indicators, dollars raised, success rate, and the number of backers, and you also have this in your brochures, Canada is doing worse than the US for Kickstarter projects. But in terms of the ambition of crowdfunding campaigns, Canadian campaigns have set higher goals for themselves on average. So this is an interesting statistic. If we go next, I compared the provinces in Canada and actually realized that a similar pattern is happening with Alberta. We have one of the lowest success rates in Kickstarter, but one of the highest goal rates in terms of targets we set for our crowdfunding campaigns. Although this graph also shows that our relative inflation of expectations is mostly driven by over-optimistic Ontarians, as you can see in the bottom graph. I also tried to do a little comparison between Calgary and Edmonton. Fortunately, we're beating Edmonton at all the performance indicators. We also have higher goals and ambitions than Edmonton. So I thought I'd share some insights from our data at Haskayne. Thank you.
Well, Mo's been talking about an innovation ecosystem, and my comments are a little more Calgary-centric as opposed to looking at the breadth of Canada because of my involvement with Calgary Economic Development. But we have been working hard at trying to be catalysts to create this this innovative ecosystem in Calgary, and in doing that, we've been traveling far and wide to do our best to help fill the vacant office spaces and to employ some of our bright underemployed and unemployed talented people. And one of the things that we hear in our travels is that we have produced some of the world's best and brightest engineers and scientists. But they're really not very good at pitching. They're not good at commercializing that idea or concept, and we need to get better at that. And I think in Calgary we are addressing that with the Hunter Center and the initiative at the University of Calgary to spread entrepreneurism throughout all the faculties, and that's just critical. And it's urgent. I think that we get on with that if we are going to compete. So maybe on to the next slide. But I think it also is really important to recognize that Calgary is an innovative center. We really don't get credit for that. Probably even people in Calgary don't talk about it much. But when you think about the incredible innovation that has taken place in Calgary in the search for and recovery and production of fossil fuels, we've really changed the world. And now we're suffering to some extent because of that. And you might call that below-ground innovation. And we need now, I think, to address innovation above the ground, so at all levels of industry and the public service. And so we have formed, and you might have heard of this, but it really is a groundswell industry, of post-secondaries, of industry associations, academia, to create the Clean Resource Innovation Network. This is actually at work, and it has a goal of really transforming the industry to a low-carbon, low-cost industry. And the goal really is to eliminate carbon emissions. And this is something we don't talk about enough, but we really are focused on innovation here, and this is something that is extremely exciting, and I think we're making great strides.
Thank you. Okay.
Well, I wanted to talk a little bit about the future of finance, and it's probably self-evident to most of the people in the room that there's already a bit of a revolution going on and a burst of new innovations in the financial sector, and that's very likely to continue over the coming decade, both from new entrants and from existing players. All the various parts of the financial industry, the technology side, and then the growing overlap in the middle for what we're colloquially calling fintech. So the kinds of changes that are going on and that I think we're going to continue to see are going to include things like more artificial intelligence and the use of algorithms. Lots of people don't know that much of the bond and money markets is essentially now priced and traded by machine, and some of you are aware that many of the best performing hedge funds essentially execute by machine using algorithms and artificial intelligence. We're going to be seeing more kinds of investment vehicles, and a big current trend, of course, has been cyber currencies, which bear quite a number of risks, and there's really quite a plethora of those, Bitcoin being the most visible, but an area that continues to unfold. We're driving more to index investing. We've seen that, depending on whose statistics you use, more than 80% of money managers don't actually outperform a passive portfolio. And so the, or an index to which, against which they're measured. And so you've seen big flows in capital markets towards index funds and exchange traded funds. So I think as we go along, we're going to see more trading, more financing, more day-to-day banking and interaction with banks essentially being done with machines. And you've noticed also there are now many different ways of making payments, and the payment development in that mid-sector is one of the hot areas for investing, because there are lots of different players that are trying to come into that game. We also have new ways of conveying financial information, financial advice, and you've seen the rise of the robo-advisors, which have particularly caught on with the younger generation. All of this is going to affect investor risks and returns, the way all the financial players compete one with the other, and the ways that companies interact with their clients. If you had trouble dealing with your bank before, it may become more difficult if you're not actually dealing with a person anymore, but in any event, there's been a number of anecdotes in that vein. The trends likely lead to fewer people employed in the financial sector, unfortunately, and more and better computerized systems continuing to be developed. Canada and other countries are not going to want any glitches in any of this, especially in things like cyber currencies, anything that involves the public's money. And the rapid spread of cyber currencies runs the risk that some part of that we end up slipping on a banana peel. Things will be dynamic. You get more index investing. Eventually that creates more opportunities for money managers. You will see automation of a lot of operations. And firms like Goldman Sachs are working on, for example, automating the entire process of new issues of securities that they would like to systematize. So the changes in finance are going to be very exciting and many, but it's also a bit daunting and maybe even a little bit scary. And we'll come back to a couple other aspects of this in the recommendations.
So as a technology entrepreneur, I'm always curious about the application and the impact of technology. And so just kind of leading off a little bit about what Mike was talking about, let's talk about trade finance and emerging technologies and established infrastructure and processes of trade finance. So today that process is incredibly slow, difficult to navigate, and incredibly costly. And there's friction, like a tremendous amount of friction in how that transaction actually happens. And today we're moving from the Internet of Information to the Internet of Value with the blockchain. We're talking about creating a global network of connection, disintermediation, and near frictionless and costless transactions with respect to trade finance. And so, blockchain, for those of you who don't know, is what we call, it's a decentralized or distributed ledger technology that essentially is immutable and securely stores transactions and the records of goods, the movement of goods or services. And so, in essence, it's a registry, as you can see here, of all of the assets and transactions that happen across a peer-to-peer network. And these transactions themselves and the assets themselves effectively get locked in blocks of data. Immutable, you can't change them, they are what they are. It's a bit like a GL ledger, if you will, across a global disintermediated network. And so if we think about this in the application to the supply chain, you think about the movement of goods and you think about the payment of those goods, and we all of a sudden have a very tightly integrated system. So we are and we will change the way that goods and services are procured and bought and sold in the future. And in fact, the Ripple was the very first interbank real-time payment system or exchange that allowed for nearly friction-free and financial transactions. Essentially, the currencies trade, and they trade freely. Ripple is a cryptocurrency, and in fact, it trades freely against all of the other world currencies. And so imagine what that can be from a trade finance perspective. Think about it as essentially a bridge currency. And interestingly enough, ATB, our local ATB, was one of the very first folks to actually create a Ripple transaction. It traded $1,000 across the Ripple network to Germany in 8 seconds. Not 8 days, not 8 weeks, not 8 months, 8 seconds. So the implication as we move from the Internet of Information to the Internet of Value for trade finance and cross-border transactions are substantial. And so, if we think about it now, even applications closer to home, we can think about a royalty registry, right? We can think about a land use registry. And so blockchain will change and transform how we do trade finance and many transactions in the future.
I think it's back to me for maybe a bit of a down topic amongst a number of positive ones, which one of the things which has become a bit unfashionable to talk about is the considerable risk that overhangs the financial markets and that overhangs the country from the continuing failure of governments to deal with debt deficits and future promises. In the aftermath of the 2008-2009 financial crisis, where everybody agreed it was necessary to do dramatic things to save the system, complacency has settled back in again. And Canada, as you can see on this chart, has its debt to GDP growing, but so does most of the other countries you can think of, the US, and the charts are much worse if you think of countries like Greece and Italy and Japan, China, etc. So this is a continuing buildup in the system that really reflects a few things. One is, at the heart, is government spending, which is already well in excess of revenues. But there's a larger issue too, which is very much driven by demography, and that's still out there awaiting us. With aging populations and a lot of the people hitting retirement age or older not having sufficient pensions or sufficient savings, the amount required for state-run pensions and health care and old age pensions, payments and medical costs and other social transfers are set to accelerate dramatically. And this is really in many of the countries of the world. And the practical taxation capacity of many governments, that is when you actually get to the point where people scream uncle, gets strained. And this doesn't work well for the younger working age population, and because they will, first of all, not like the trend, and secondly, they won't like the taxes that go with these trends. So I think there's a significant risk in Canada, and we'll come back to this in the recommendations, but also everywhere in many of the other countries of the world, that the markets become transfixed by a puzzle that has no easy solution. And governments that run out of rope either inflate, renegotiate or restructure or repudiate either the obligations themselves or the entitlements of the constituents, so the amounts that people receive and all those various kinds of payments I mentioned. So I think there's still a risk in all of this that we have significant financial market turmoil and even a risk of social discord coming out of this trend.
Okay, thank you very much. So that was, in a sense, a review of where we are today, what the future may look like. And so what I've asked each panelist to do is give us one recommendation that we need to think about going forward. And so we're going to start with Leanna.
Well, I still think that we have a good thing going, so for the most part. So the main challenge is not to mess it up. So I think that Canada must continue to trade in our most valuable commodity, which I think is knowledge. And it means a lot of things from the perspective of government funding of R&D in our education system and training. But among other things, it means capitalizing on our underground innovation that Steve was referring to, and probably bringing it more, springboarding off it to bring it above ground. And I also think that we should try to cherish our trade ties with our powerful neighbor south of the border. And that's not to say that we should not diversify, but we should be careful not to throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Thank you.
Sure. Well, my thought process on this is that given again the fact that a lot of trade growth is coming from some of the developing markets, as well as the overall consumption in some of these developing markets is growing at a much higher rate than traditional OECD countries. What we need to do is to take a concerted effort to really understand, again, developing markets are not a monolith, right? So what we need to understand is which of these developing markets are we best positioned to do trade with, what is it that we can sell them, and perhaps what trade, what policy, what industry initiatives are required in order to facilitate that particular growth.
I think we have a really interesting and unique use case to actually lead how emerging technologies will be shaped and governed in the future. If you think about it from trade finance perspective or royalty management, I think we're already experimenting. The government of Canada has already done some blockchain experimentation with Project Jasper. They know how it works. They understand the technology. They know that it is not ready for prime time, and that the infrastructure that we already have in place today is working as designed. But I think that what's important that we understand is that we don't early bind legislation around these types of emerging technologies and actually stifle the potential of them. Can you imagine if we started to clamp down the internet 20 years ago, where we would be today? And so we have the right ingredients for sure. We have stable government, we have stable banking system, we have good infrastructure. And so we have all of the right ingredients. And so we just need to make sure that as Canada, we take our place at the table and create those initiatives and lead those initiatives to shape the future.
Exactly, building on your point, Alice, I think we should start trying to be the first or among the first in adopting a lot of new technologies. A while ago, a publisher sent me a textbook to review. They had made the Canadian version of a US textbook, and in the Canadian version, they had added a paragraph saying, Canadians are among the first to adopt new technology. And I'm sitting there not being able to get an Uber after years since it's been in other countries, and even emerging economies have developed their own Uber alternatives, and thinking, oh, really? And so I think a lot of new technologies, yes, a lot of new technologies are so unpredictable, so much uncertainty, we can't know what's going to happen. But in a lot of cases, we know that it's coming. We know it's going to happen, and we know that it needs a regulatory framework. We know blockchain is coming. We know self-driving cars is coming. We know where genomics is going. We know that drone delivery is going to happen. We know all of this is going to happen, it's going to be ubiquitous, so why don't we, in a way, try to be the first? Create some sort of task force between government, industry, academia, try to create the regulatory frameworks to be one of the first in adopting each of these instead of waiting to see over and over again what happens in other cities and jurisdictions. That's my recommendation.
So I've got two separate topics. So on the first one, which is sort of the future of finance, and I realize this recommendation may seem a little boring to some, but we really do need the securities regulatory framework that continues to be innovative and strong enough to make sure that all this change happens in a way that works, for everybody. We also need measures, as we've got a lot of small players coming in with new innovations that actually encourage competition, and the financial sector is a sector that naturally tends to get concentrated and is probably over-concentrated because economies of scale are so important. But we do need to be able to encourage competition. And all the banks and financial institutions will need customer service that's at a very, very high level, and then we need the consumer protection legislation when you have more and more functions being managed by machine to ensure that there is troubleshooting both within the institutions and for the customer generally to make sure they get a fair shake. And then for all these new roles in the financial sector, we need people to be going to where the trends are rather than to where we've been. Now on the sort of more somber topic of the government situation, I would say Canada is already ahead of a number of other countries because our medical system costs are already on budget, and the main pension plan is actually separately, though not fully funded, and it's segregated. We will need lower deficits over the economic cycles. We will need to continue pre-funding pension obligations at the national level. We need that securities regulatory framework I mentioned, and we need the right prudent capital requirements for the banks and the investment firms and the intermediaries that are going to be dealing with all of us as customers. We're actually, Canada's among a small group of countries that's actually positioned to outperform in this if we make the right moves. But observers like the Bank of International Settlements see risks if we head the wrong way and in the wrong move. So we have the opportunity to do something great here and to look better than other countries, and to actually be better, but we have to have the right policies.
Well, again, my comment is more Calgary-centric, but you may recall hearing about a month ago that Calgary was once again named the 5th most livable city in the world, and I'm told that it's hard for us to get better because of weather. But I think all of that rating was before last summer, so who knows? Yeah. We may have even climbed. But I think it's important that we continue to focus on things like that because we want to retain our talent and we want to attract talent. And over this past year or so, we have visited or been visited by leaders from cities like Pittsburgh and Denver and others who have faced problems similar to what we have faced in the past little while, and except that they are, frankly, were way worse condition than we are or have been. But we do need to address our office space issue, and we need to create opportunities for our young and talented workforce. And one clear lesson that has emerged from our conversations with other cities who have been in the same boat is the need to continue to invest in first-class infrastructure like airports and arenas and stadiums and art facilities. And these other cities have done that, and when you study what they've done, it actually has attracted investment and growth because what they're really focused on is that quality of life and the pride in their cities. So I think our opportunity is the Rivers District, and I'm not wanting to get into the political campaign here, but you will have heard the mayor talk about a vision for the Rivers District last week, and he was actually criticized because for saying it was a vision because all of the elements of it have been talked about, and they have. But it is something that we actually helped him to write and pull together as a vision. And I hope that it will be embraced by him or by the another mayor or elected council members. And it really is a new arena, an event center. It's BMO expansion of the trade show and convention center. It's Arts Commons and it's rainforest. It's the opportunity to create an innovative focus and a really exciting, dynamic part of our city that will attract innovators, will keep our bright young workforce, and who knows, we may even get Amazon in there. In fact, Alice we talked about making a plug because, and Alice, you can talk about this, but we really are mounting our forces to go after Amazon, and one of, they want opportunities in or near downtown, and West Village, East Village. Downtown office space are those opportunities. So maybe, Alice, you could mention our crowdsourcing.
Just a little local plug. So Calgary Economic Development just launched their very first crowdsourcing community to help with the Amazon pitch. And so it launched last night at 8 o'clock. I'm sure you can find the link on the Calgary Economic Development website. We're hosting an innovation challenge for ideation to really start to incentivize and understand the great community that we live in and work in and are all passionate about. And then just for another little plug, of course, it's being hosted by Chaotix, which is a local Calgary technology company. And so you not only have an opportunity to help with the pitch to Amazon, but you also have an opportunity to look at some of the great technology that we have here and Calgary-based, so global technology. So, YYC, hashtag YYC Love, I think is what the hashtag is, but you can certainly find it on the Calgary Economic Development website, and we'll get it shared out socially as well.
And Alice is really part of the steering committee that's driving our response to the RFP, which has to be in by October the 19th.
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, before we open it up to Q&A from the floor, and I know there's been lots of really interesting ideas put forth, and so you probably have some good questions to ask and explore. But first, I want to ask you, if I was to send a message back to Mr. Haskayne, I want to take a vote. Is the glass half full or half empty for Canada? How many think we will be the country of choice for doing business? How many would say yes? Okay. Any no's? Okay, so we can tell Mr. Haskayne we learned from the video we are not a country in search of a problem.
Where is the blockchain peer-to-peer network being built and who pays for it?
I think, Alice, you can start with that.
Isn't that an interesting question? So the blockchain, blockchain is actually a technology protocol. And so there's a number of blockchain initiatives that are being built. In fact, Bitcoin, for example, is a cryptocurrency that is based on the blockchain protocol. And so just as the internet was built, the blockchain protocol is being built. And so it's decentralized. It doesn't live anywhere. In fact, there are nodes of it everywhere. And there's, if you actually do a little bit of work and understand how blockchain works, there's something called mining and how they actually secure the transactions and validate the transactions. But essentially, imagine you create a transaction. I've decided to give you $20. You accept my $20. That transaction is immutable. It becomes a fact in record. And there is no real way, there's a complex way to do it, but there is no real way to be able to back that transaction out. It becomes a permanent part of the history of the record.
Good morning. Questions addressed to Mike and to Alice. I'm a CFO of 2 early-stage companies, and one of the things I did not see talked about is access to capital. If we want to grow the jobs, we need to have access to capital. And what I see from my seat is that we're being pulled every place else in the world as opposed to here. So there's a big draw away from it. And when you time that with like Mike's comments on the taxes and so forth, how do you reconcile that situation?
You start, Alice, go ahead.
Why don't I start on the seed or the pre-seed capital? And in fact, as part of the Haskayne, I'm an associate director of what we call Creative Destruction Lab for the Rockies. And we are in fact trying to change that. Because, you know, there's no shortage of good technology initiatives and commercialization here. What there is a shortage of access to capital, access to entrepreneurial expertise, access to networking connections. And so, in fact, we're launching a program, a little plug, hey, Jim, launching a program called Creative Destruction Lab for the Rockies here in November, and that really is our intent, is to change that. So by bringing in entrepreneurs, academic entrepreneurs, industry entrepreneurs with early stage technologies that need help in commercialization. Over a 9-month program, we will work with them, we will give them access and create opportunities for them to meet with super angels and entrepreneurs who have created and scaled massive businesses. And effectively, we will change the way technology is commercialized here in Alberta, in the prairies, and effectively nationally. So, modeled after a program that came out of the University of Toronto Rockies School of Business. So.
And I'll just add a couple of things because Alice covered that very well. But you know, so part of it is making sure we have the quality of opportunities that people both in Canada and elsewhere want to invest in, and then making people aware of those through both financial intermediaries and through things like what Alice just mentioned with the Creative Destruction Lab. And the other thing, you know, and I think you've seen this over the years too, James, is that these things run in cycles, and we're currently in a cycle where, you know, particularly in the resource sector and oil and gas, the U.S. and other international investors are more reticent and sort of moving away, and there's a whole bunch of variables that go into that. So part of it is the bigger picture stuff at the political and macroeconomic level, to have Canada be an attractive place to be. Part of it is that the things in which we offer, the companies in which people can invest, look attractive, and part of it is obviously having the people, the legal system, the ways of doing business, the rule of law that make and closeness to the U.S. markets that make Canada a place for these companies to be operating from.
Mo, did you want to add anything on Kickstarter?
I think crowdfunding is one of the ways in which access to capital will start being sort of improved. Although when I look at the statistics, the average amount raised on crowdfunding, or at least on Kickstarter, isn't that high. These are I would say the average of all of Kickstarter is $5,000 for a project. Although there are certain categories like technology, design, and video games that raise up to higher amounts, maybe $80,000 or something for technology. So this covers a certain, I would say, a certain demography of entrepreneurial initiatives that's not really covered by other sources. And if we can improve on that, we're covering parts of the ecosystem that aren't otherwise covered by other financial institutions.
Another question. Okay.
Rolf Wenzel, IMC. Germany has this 1,000 companies with 1,000 people, that mid-size corporate layer there that absorbs little companies, it's nimble capital. And if you agree Canada lacks this, I'd be interested to see how you think we could foster growth in that segment.
Who would like to?
I agree.
I think that we have agreement. Okay.
Well, I think it's all about creating that ecosystem that we've talked about too. You know, we have to be deliberate about it, and a lot of that is just bringing people together and for collision and creating those ideas and bringing in the capital and embedding entrepreneurial thinking into the university. We need to do all of those things, I think, to make it happen.
And I hear two things. Sorry, just one is the Amazon attraction plus the attraction of the 1,000 companies with 1,000 Leanna.
Just to reiterate what Mike was saying, we need to have an attractive regulatory environment that would continue to make it attractive for businesses to grow and develop here.
All right.
I could add just one thing
Yeah,
too,
sure.
which, you know, the German companies that you mentioned, you know, a lot of those have figured out a very good basis on which to compete. That is, they have to figure out, well, where's our distinctive competitive advantage and how do we, you know, maintain that and enable us to stay as a pretty good medium-sized company. And you know, one of the things that we need to really focus on is trying to figure out those competitive advantages. And as we were talking about in the banking sector and in oil and gas and everything, there are definite advantages to scale, and you know, there tends to be a tendency towards concentration and companies getting bought up, and so over time, I think it'll be imperative for us to figure out, you know, many of those German companies have high quality products and they really have a distinctive market niche, and are not, you know, sort of run of the mill or commodity type products. So we need more of that, I guess.
So one last question.
Thanks. My name is Dan Dorland with National Bank. This question is probably directed to Mike more than anyone, but I was just curious about the panel's thoughts on our tax system, the developments that have happened there, and whether we're competitive and whether we need to, you know, include that as a distinctive competitive advantage to succeed.
Want me to start on that? Okay. I think nobody likes more taxes. I would say when we look at Canada in the global context, we're about okay, but we probably don't want to have it get any higher because it will create competitive disadvantage then. I would say our tax system intermingled with everything else that's great about Canada that you've been hearing here probably, and the fact that, you know, we do have the medical costs in the already on the budget, so notwithstanding, you know, there's always room for improvement in all these various sectors, there is there is good fairness in the Canadian system in some respects relative to other countries. So I would say, you know, part of the challenge for governments now is, you know, we can't expect to have all of the services and things that we have without having taxes about where they are, I don't think. But we've got to be careful not to create a competitive disadvantage by moving any further along that spectrum. I don't know if anybody else wants to jump in on that.
Totally agree. And one of the risks is watching the U.S. and, you know, if they drop their corporate tax rate, that's going to create some problems for us that we have to respond to.